These are my go-to settings for the Sony Alpha 7R Mark IV. Hi folks, I'm Juan Pons, and first off, before I get into this video, I want to apologize. I've been out of pocket for a couple of weeks. Haven't been able to make any new videos. I was out traveling, and then just after I got back from traveling, we got a new puppy, and that's been taking a lot of my time, as you can imagine. He's running around here, so you may hear him during this recording, but hopefully not. Anyways, I've had a lot of questions from people about, what are my go-to settings when using my new Sony Alpha A7R Mark IV. So I thought I'd take a little bit of time and go through the settings in the camera and tell you, what my settings are, why I did that, and what these settings mean. By no means am I going to go through every setting in the camera. There are hundreds of settings. So if I don't cover it during this video, you can assume that I left my camera in the default mode for that specific setting. By the way, this is going to be a longish video because there's lots and lots of settings here to go through, but I think it's worthwhile doing that. Anyways, let's get started. We're here in the first camera menu item, with the little camera icon with the number 1, and we're in the first page of 15. So let's go down some of these. I'm always shooting in RAW format, and that's what I would encourage folks to do, is always shoot in RAW format. So my camera never really leaves from the RAW format. We have these expensive cameras. We want to take advantage of every bit of image quality that we can, that these cameras can produce. So that's why we want to be shooting in RAW format. Another item here that's been controversial for a lot of folks is the RAW file type, whether you want compressed or uncompressed. These are my thoughts. Most of the time, I'm going to be shooting in compressed format. And the reason for that is because that's how this camera is going to perform its best. It's going to be able to write those files out as quickly as possible. It's going to be able to keep up with that high-speed frame rate as well. And what the camera is doing is compressing those files before it actually saves them out. But this is a lossless compression, not like a JPEG compression, which is lossy. This is lossless. So it's keeping all of the image quality in there. Wait a second. I said it's lossless compression. Yes, you heard me right. And I am going to wake up just about every troll that's out there on the internet. Yes, technically is the compressed format in the Sonys, it's a lossy compression. But for all effects and purposes, for everyday shooting, for all of us out in the real world, the quality is almost imperceptible between the compressed and the uncompressed. So yes, technically it's a lossy compression, but practically from a quality perspective, it's essentially no different than a lossless compression. So just wanted to set the record straight and prevent all the internet trolls out there from coming down hard on me. Okay, let's keep going. Now, when would I use uncompressed? The only time I personally use uncompressed is if I am shooting a, let's say, a sunset or a sunrise, where I have very, very fine gradations in the colors. That's the only time I'm going to move over to uncompressed. And in those situations, I'm not really all that concerned about, fast frame rate, because I am not shooting, 10 frames a second as the sun is setting or rising. So in those situations, I will shoot an uncompressed file. But other than that, I always leave it uncompressed. Now, going down some of these other items, JPEG quality, I leave it an extra fine, and JPEG image size at 60 megapixels. I never really shoot JPEG, but I leave those as the defaults just in case. I've done this, we all do this. By mistake, I switched the camera to JPEG, and I got some incredible shots. And I was kicking myself, but at least I had it to the best quality JPEG I was able to produce. So I was able to still get some decent images out of that. We go down to our aspect ratio. We're going to leave that at 3:2. This camera allows you to have a bunch of different settings, but 3:2 is a typical SLR aspect ratio, so I'm going to keep with that. APS-C Super 35mm. I leave this on auto, and what this is when you're shooting video, you know what the aspect ratio or what how the camera is going to record that video. Also, it applies when you use crop sensor lenses on this camera, because you can put the crop sensor lenses from Sony on this camera and how the camera is going to behave. If you have it on auto, what it's going to do is it's going to crop in the frame, you know, to correlate for the crop sensor lens. If you left it on one of the other settings, for example, if you left it on off and you put a crop sensor lens on this camera, what will happen is you'll get, you know, black space around. It will only show you the image in the center of the frame. So auto, the camera will automatically switch onto a APS-C or crop frame if it detects a lens, and also Super 35 when you're shooting videos, it'll set it to Super 35 mode. Let's go to the second page here on the first camera settings. Long exposure noise reduction, I always have that set to off. I don't want the camera to do the long exposure noise reduction. I'm going to do that later on in the digital darkroom in Lightroom. Even though we're shooting RAW, so this really shouldn't matter the color space, I set the color space to Adobe RGB. And again, the reason is because if I mistake, I set the camera to JPEG mode, I want to be able to encompass as much color as I possibly can. And Adobe RGB is a much wider color space than sRGB. So that's why I set it up to Adobe RGB. Again, remember, I'm not going to go through every single menu. I'm only going through the items that I use, that are my go-to settings on the camera itself. Here you have another menu item that allows you to change the drive mode. We typically do that by pressing on the left side of the wheel, the back wheel, to change the drive mode, but you can also do it through the menu items here. Bracket settings. Now, this is something that I do change. And there are two things that I do. The bracket order, I change it to 0, minus, and then plus. Actually, I think that's the default, the 0, minus, plus. And what that'll do is it'll give me the middle exposure, if you will, first, and then it will do the minus exposures, and then at the end we'll do the plus exposures. But the one thing that is not by default, this is the default off. I typically set my self timer during bracket to 2, if not 5 seconds. And what this does is that automatically, if you go into the bracket mode, it will automatically set a timer for when you're doing that bracket. And typically when I'm doing a bracket, I have the camera on a tripod. So this will automatically set a timer mode and do 2-second countdown and then take all my shots in a row without having to hold that shutter button down, which is also really important to me. Interval shoot functions, I should say. This is the time-lapse setting in the camera. You know, I'm not going to go into the settings here. Maybe I'll do that as a separate video on how to use this mode. Please let me know. Shoot off a comment in the comment section if you want me to do a little intro or a little video on the time-lapse or interval shooting function on the cameras. Pixel shift, I don't use all that often, once in a while, so that's why I set to off. Now we're on page 4 now, and really there's nothing here that I really change. Let's go into the autofocus 1 page, and that's page 5 of 15 in this section. And here you can change your focus mode. I also have my C1 to allow me to change, or C1 or C2 to change my focus modes as well, my custom buttons on the top of the camera. But here you can also change that. I also have that set in my function menu that we're going to go over a little later on. Now, these two settings here, priority set in AFS and priority set in AFC. And when you go to these, you can see that mine are set to release. The default, I believe, is balance emphasis. And you have three options: autofocus, release, and balance emphasis. Now, what is this? Priority set in autofocus single mode, or if we do priority set in autofocus continuous mode. I have both set exactly the same. And what this means is that, for example, if I have this set to autofocus to AF mode, when I press that shutter down, the camera is not going to take a picture unless it can determine that your primary subject is in focus. Meaning that little green box comes up and you get a little, audible confirmation if you're in single mode. In continuous mode, it may do it when you're, it may not give you those confirmations. But if you set either of these to AF, what's going to happen is the camera will not take a picture unless it thinks it's in focus. And you may think that's a good thing, but it's really not. Because oftentimes I may, recompose my shot, and my focus point, which may be in the center of the frame, may actually be in an area that I don't want to be in focus. I want another part of the frame to be in focus. So that's why I have mine on release. What release means is that no matter what, whenever I press that shutter button, the camera is going to take a picture. To me, that's absolutely important. I don't want the camera to override my decision. And balance emphasis is, it's kind of like a happy medium. The camera decides which kind of mode to go in. So again, I don't want the camera to override my decision to actually take a picture. So I have these two, whether I'm in single mode or continuous mode, to actually release. I know some people that may actually set the autofocus single mode into AF so that it won't take a picture, because we're in single mode, you're typically shooting landscapes. When you're shooting in AFC, you're shooting action, wildlife, or action sports. So you want that to be release. So again, these two settings for me are super, super important. I want the camera to take a picture every time I press that shutter button. I don't want it to decide on its own that, that it should not take a picture. Again, focus area is which type of focus mechanism you're using. You're using the center or zone or flexible spot. Again, I have that set on one of the menu options as well. The function menu that I will go into a little bit later, but you can change it here as well. Another setting that I like to have off is the switch vertical horizontal autofocus area. And you may actually want to turn it on. And what this does is the camera will remember which focus point you had set. So for example, let's say you're in flexible mode and you move the focus point to the upper right hand side when you're shooting in horizontal, and then you switch to vertical, but in vertical you may have had it in the center down at the bottom. So as you switch the camera from horizontal to vertical, what it will do is remember that last setting independently, whether you're horizontal or vertical. I don't like that. I like to have it always stay in the same spot, whether I'm horizontal or vertical, because I know immediately if I need to move it, where I'm going to move it from, the origin point. I may not remember what it was set last when I switched to vertical mode. So that's why I have this to off. But you could turn it to on if that's something that you like. Myself, I'd leave it off. The AF illuminator is a little light that comes on when you're trying to, when the camera's trying to autofocus on something. I have that off, so it doesn't actually turn that light on. Because that may ruin a shot if you're shooting night photography or if you're trying to do light painting. Or it may be annoying if you're with a bunch of other people. So I actually turn that AF illuminator off. Now, let's go back over here. Face/eye autofocus set. So this is one of the areas that I do customize as well. I make sure that the face and eye priority autofocus is on. I changed my subject detection from human to animal because I'm most likely shooting animals, not people. I'm not a wedding or portrait photographer. I don't really shoot pictures of people that often. I'm mostly shooting animals. So I set mine to animal eye detection. And with animal eye detection, you know, you don't have a left eye. It really just goes default into auto. And then these two other settings I leave on: the face eye frame display, which actually puts a little frame around the face or around the eye, and the animal eye display is set to on. Okay, so autofocus tracking sensitivity. I like that to be on responsive. I want my camera autofocus system to be as responsive as possible. I don't want it to lock onto something. What it means is that if an animal is moving, it will keep tracking that animal as well as it possibly can. It may not kind of like lock on your focus and leave it there. It will actually be a lot more responsive. So that's why I have set mine to 5. Let's look at other settings here. Pre-autofocus, I set that to off, because otherwise your camera is going to be autofocusing all the time, and that can actually wear your battery down. So I actually turn that off. Autofocus error registration, I set that to on, and that's a separate video because this is actually quite complicated. I'm going to tell you a little bit of what it is, and then if you guys are interested in me talking about the autofocus error registration, I can do a separate video on that because it's actually a very useful feature. But what this feature allows me to do is program a button. Like I have C1 programmed into this function. It allows me to, at any point in time, press C1 and take me to center focus mode. And that's what I've programmed. But you could have it take you to, you know, zone, or have it take you to spot in a specific area or something like that. That's what AF error registration does. It a little bit, there's a number of steps for setting that up, but it's actually really useful. So again, if you want me to cover that and you're interested in that, just let me know. I'll make sure to do another video on that specific setting. And this allows you to delete the registration if you needed to. Focus frame color, I like it. I like to set it to red so it stands out a little bit more. I believe that the default is white, so I like to set it to red instead. Let's keep going here. Display continuous autofocus area is on. These are default actually. These are all default settings. Let's go on to page number 9. These are all, again, default settings. Here I can change my ISO. The metering mode, my camera always set to multi. Multi is the most sophisticated metering mode that the camera provides. So that's why I like to set it to multi. Yes, there are certain situations where I may need to do a spot metering mode, but that's very few and far between. And if you have it set on spot metering mode and you forget to change it, you may have some issues with exposure. Multi takes advantage or leverages the millions of dollars that these camera companies have spent in developing sophisticated metering algorithms. The camera is helping you come up with the correct exposure. So that's why I leave mine on multi. Another one that I set is the spot metering point. And what this does is, if I set my camera to spot metering, where the camera, where the spot is, where the camera is going to use that spot for metering. The default is to be the center of the frame, but I like to have it set to follow the focus point. And this is very good, especially if I'm doing macro work. Excuse me. Where I will actually set the focus point, move my focus point around until the most relevant part of my image. And I also want the camera to meter on that because that's going to be my central point of the frame. So the default is center, will always spot metering on the center of the frame. But if you set it to focus point link and you move that focus point, the spot metering will follow that focus point. On page 10, I believe, oh yes, these are the default. Exposure step is at thirds of a stop. automatic exposure lock with shutters on, so that if I'm holding down that shutter down, it actually locks the exposure. I don't really use flash anymore. I used to do quite a bit. I don't use flash anymore. So I leave these set to the default. So we're on page 12 now of 15 on this first menu item. White balance. I shoot white balance 99.9% of the time, on automatic white balance, I should say. And the reason is because I'm shooting RAW, so I can adjust my white balance after the fact without an issue. So there is no reason for me to change my white balance to anything else. Well, I said no reason, but there is a specific reason, because I consider white balance to be another creative choice. So there are certain situations when I'm shooting, you know, a sunset or a silhouette of a lighthouse or something like that, I may actually change my white balance to make the image a lot warmer, or even kind of yellowish or orangey. So yeah, sometimes I'll go in and change my white balance, but that's very far in between, because I can always do that in post-processing. I may do it in the camera actually to preview what the result is going to be, but typically I leave this set to auto. Priority set, auto white balance, DRO. Okay, this is another kind of controversial issue. So DRO stands for Dynamic Range Optimization. And this is Sony's way of providing you on your camera, on the back of your camera or on your viewfinder after you take a picture, a preview that will look like what you may have done in post-processing. Meaning it'll bring out the shadows, it'll tone down the highlights, and try to show you an image, you know, or show you the potential for that particular image. And you have a bunch of different settings in here. You have different levels of DRO. You have automatic DRO. You have level 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, or you can have it off. Now, this is not changing your raw file. This is only changing the preview that you're getting. The embedded JPEG that's in the raw file that's used by the camera when you're viewing a raw file, or when it first gets brought into Lightroom or an Adobe Camera Raw. You will notice that when you bring camera photos into Lightroom, especially if you have DRO on, the images look amazing, and then Lightroom goes and processes them, and then they look kind of dark. So because DRO has kind of like done, you know, automatic adjustments on your image to make it look the best that it can. Now, the dark side of DRO, because you'd think based on that you would always want DRO on, and I like DRO, but the dark side of DRO is that because you're looking at a image that's already been processed, whether it's, you know, as a live view when you're looking through the viewfinder or on the back of the camera, or after you've taken the image, you tend to underexpose your images quite a bit when you have DRO on. Because you know, the histogram that's shown to you is one after processing of the image, as opposed to a histogram that's shown to you, you know, based on the raw data. So if you like to do the exposure based on the histogram, I suggest you turn DRO off. But, you know, sometimes I have it on, sometimes I have it off, depending on my mood. And I know that if I have it on, that I can overexpose my images a little bit more without, you know, too much trouble, because I know I'll be able to recover those, and I know I'm not hitting those highlights just yet. So DRO, again, dynamic range optimization, play around with it, see how you like it now that you kind of understand what it does. I think my default setting is to have it off, but sometimes I like to have it on because it's nice to see kind of a already processed image on the back of your camera. Okay, these things, creative styles and picture profiles, I have those set to standard and off because I'm shooting RAW. This is really specific for when you're shooting JPEG, when the images are being processed. Shutter auto white balance lock. Again, this is like auto exposure lock, that the camera will lock the white balance if you have that shutter halfway pressed. I have set to off because, again, I'll let the camera choose the correct white balance automatically. It does a really good job at it. And if not, I can change it in my digital darkroom afterwards. It's really easy to do. So there's no point in locking that. focus assist. I think these are all really on our default settings, meaning the focus magnification time, there's no limit. The initial focus, the initial focus magnification is set to 1. And manual focus assist, what this means is that once I turn my, when I'm in manual focus mode and I turn my focus ring, the camera will turn on focus assist, which basically amplifies or magnifies the image that I'm seeing. Okay, let's talk about peaking. Peaking settings. If you don't know what peaking is, what peaking allows me to do is when I'm shooting in manual mode, it allows, the camera will show me in the viewfinder or the rear display an outline in different colors. I have highlighted red because it stands out the most of the areas of my frame that are in focus. So as I turn my manual focus ring on my lens, again, I need to be in manual focus mode. As I turn that focus ring, the areas that are in focus will have a red outline to them. I would try to show you this, but it turns out that the way that I'm recording my camera menus through an HDMI cable connected to my camera does not show the peaking. Doesn't translate. It translates or it shows in the back of your camera or in the viewfinder, but it just doesn't show in the way that I'm recording this. So I can't demonstrate that to you. But my settings for peaking are going to be on, high, and red. Okay? And the reason I have it set to high is so that it's actually more sensitive and shows me the peaking, you know, more prominently, if you will. Easier to see. Page 15, anti-flicker shoot. And I have that set to off. And anti-flicker shoot, what it does, actually we can read here in that the camera will actually change the timing of when the image is going to be made in order to capture an image. So for example, some TVs, or actually all TVs, all displays, they're not constant. They kind of flicker, if you will, if you do them at fast enough speed. So if you do your shot at the wrong time, you may see a black screen, or you may see half a screen. The anti-flicker will actually try to display the entire image. But I never worry about that. I don't change it, so it's in the default. All the other settings on this page are in the default. Okay. Now we're in camera menu 2, and we're going to talk about a little bit about the video mode. I shoot videos with these cameras from time to time. I'm going to go through these really quickly. Right now, some of these settings are not enabled because the camera is not in video mode. In order for me to change these exposure mode settings, I need to have the camera set to movie mode. But exposure mode would allow me to change when I go into video mode, whether the camera is going to be an aperture priority, shutter priority, or manual or whatnot. I usually set mine to shutter priority in most cases. File format, I have it set to this XAVC S4K. So I'm shooting 4K as big as possible on the camera. I have my record settings to 30p, 60 megabits. And the reason is, you know, this 100 megabits is the highest quality, but it's a much larger file as well. And for most of the stuff that I'm doing, the 60 megabits is more than enough quality. So that's why I'm shooting 3060M. We're not going to talk about some of these other settings. Again, these are really for when we're shooting movies. If you look at the heading here, movie 2, these are when we're shooting movies with the cameras or videos. Autofocus drive speed is going to be normal. You can actually set it to be slower to give you not such a sudden and abrupt autofocus change in the frame. So but I don't typically do a lot of videos with autofocus. So that's why I don't care. I typically shoot videos in manual focus, so I know exactly what I'm focusing on. The tracking sensitivity, I again have it as responsive. I believe the default is standard. And the other settings here are really just default settings on the camera. So I don't really change these all that often. Again, I don't shoot videos with these cameras all that much. Oops. Okay, so let's go to page 2. We're talking about video mode, the movie 2. We already looked at this. Movie 3, we looked at this one already. Now, this is another setting that is really, really crucial for me. And this has to do with, you know, once you put the camera in movie mode, how do you start shooting movies? Do you start shooting movies with the shutter button, or you start shooting movies with the movie record button? I usually do it with the movie record button. So that's why I turn this off. I don't want to take movies pressing the shutter button. Again, this has nothing to do with pressing the shutter button or starting movies when you're in one of the camera still modes like manual or shutter priority or aperture priority. This really has to do with once you put the camera in movie mode on the top dial, how do you start movies? Do you start movies by pressing the shutter button, or you start movies by pressing the movie button? I don't like it with the movie button, with the shutter button, only with the movie button on the back. Okay, page 5 in the camera 2 menu, we have silent shooting, which you can turn on or off. This gives you a, this is again the A7R Mark IV, so it does have a conventional shutter, mechanical shutter. So this will turn the mechanical shutter off and give you silent shooting. So these I have in the default settings. Now, release without lens. My recommendation for most people, if you have all autofocus lenses, is actually to turn this on to disable. And what this will do is that if the lens is not in all the way, the camera will not take a picture. You press that shutter and it won't do anything. Now, the reason I have mine set to enable is because I do have one lens really that is a fully manual lens. It has no electronic connections whatsoever. And if I put that lens on this camera and then try to take a picture and I have this set to disable, you know, the camera won't take a picture. It will, you press that shutter and it won't take a picture because it's set to disable. Because if the camera doesn't know there's a lens attached to it at that point. So it will disable the shutter. But so because I have a manual lens, I set that to enable. However, I do like to set this to disable. And the reason for that is because there's nothing worse than taking a bunch of shots and then realize you don't have a memory card installed on your camera. You know, I'm sure this happened to, you know, I know it happened to me quite a bit when I was shooting film, that I would take a bunch of shots and then, oh man, I have no film in the camera. Well, the same thing here. If you set to this to disable, the camera will not take any pictures if there is no card in the camera. I think it's really, really important. And it has saved my skin many, many times. SteadyShot settings, I leave this to auto, the default. And this basically, the image stabilization will adjust depending on the focal length of your lenses, how long you're shooting. Again, I would just leave it on auto. The camera does a good job at keeping track of that. This is the zoom levels. You know, again, this is disabled at this point. So I would leave those as default. I don't think you can change those very much unless you have specific lenses that have motorized zooms. Okay, let's look at page 7. And I'm going to leave these as they are, that I don't touch those. My finder frame rate, I do set that to high. I believe the default is to be on standard. The finder frame rate high gives you a better image quality on the viewfinder. So I like to have that on high frame rate. Zebras. What are zebras? What zebras does is allows you to see parts of the image which may be overexposed. This is like kind of like live blinkies. If you were coming from a DSLR, Canon, Nikon, or whatever, and you took an image and then you preview it on the back, if you had any areas that were exposed, those areas would blink. Well, zebras is similar to that, except that it's shown to you live before you even take a shot. And what happens is you will get these lines over the areas, you know, these moving lines over the areas of the image that are overexposed. So I love having zebras because it allows me to make sure that no parts of my image are overexposed. Now, the important thing here, if you're going to turn zebras on, is to set your zebra level to 100 plus. Very important, because I think the default is something like 80 or 70, something like that. And what will happen is the camera will give you warnings about something being overexposed prematurely. So you want to be on 100 plus, and that will give you zebras just before you get overexposed, before those areas get overexposed. So even if you see a little bit of zebras in the frame, you're still good, even at 100 plus. So the zebras are just an indication that, yeah, you're about to go overexposed. So oftentimes I'm okay if I see a few little zebras in there on my frame, especially if I'm in 100 plus mode. Grid line. I like to set mine on the rule of thirds so that I get a rule of thirds overlay over the image that I'm shooting, whether it's in the viewfinder or the screen on the back of the camera. Again, just a little bit of aid, and it helps me keep my viewfinder level, my camera level as well, which is something I'm notoriously bad about doing, especially if I'm not you know, standing straight. If I am kneeling on one knee, or I'm laying down on the ground, or trying to shoot low, you know, 99% of the time, my camera is not going to be level. So having those rule of thirds line not only helps me with the composition, but it helps me to keep my frame level. So that's why I like to have the rule of thirds turned on. I think exposure set guide, now the default is off, and that's the way it should be. Exposure set guide is another way of displaying your exposure by having this ribbon at the bottom of your frame. So I turn that off because it just takes room and it's redundant information. Not sure why that's even there, because you already have that info somewhere else. So it's just a different way to look at exposure information. So I make sure that that's always off. On the display, an auto review page here, page 8 of 11 on camera 2. My live view display, the camera, I always want to make sure that the setting effect is on, which this means is that any exposure that you're doing, exposure compensation, or change in exposure settings are reflected in your viewfinder. So very, really, really important. Continuous shoot length. And I like this. This is actually really, really neat. And what this means, and you have 3 different options: always display, shoot only, display only when you're shooting, or not displayed. I like to just have it set to shoot only display. And what this does, it gives you a line on the left side of your frame as you're looking through the viewfinder, an indication that how full your buffer is on your camera. So this line, when you start shooting in continuous mode, you'll see the line is kind of long all the way from the bottom of the frame to the top of the frame on the left-hand side. But as you're shooting, that line shrinks. You're kind of indicating how many images you have left in your frame buffer. So it's actually really helpful to help you manage that frame buffer, so you don't all of a sudden, you know, fill up that frame buffer and I'm like, oh my God, I'm missing the best shot because my frame was full. So you can have that shown all the time, or you can have that not show at all, or you can have it show only when you're pressing the shutter down. You know, what's interesting is on this camera, the A7R4, I have this set to shoot only or display only when I'm shooting. Whereas on the A9, I have it to display all the time. And the reason for that is because the A9 is so silent that I like it better when it's displayed all the time. It's a little bit different in the way I have my 2 cameras set. Auto review. I have auto review set to off because I don't want the camera to review the image I just took in the viewfinder. I want to make sure that my camera is always ready to take a shot. So only want it to display once I press that review button on the back of the camera. So always set to auto review off, and I believe that now that is the standard. That is the default. Okay, now this is kind of complicated, and you know what we're going to do is we are going to set this up for a different video. My custom key settings, and the reason for that is because I don't want to make this video longer than it already is. So I'll do a follow-up video on my custom key settings, and as well as my function menu set as well. Okay? The next thing I'm going to talk about here is the dial setup. And I believe that the default is the reverse of what I've always been used to. When I came from Canon, and whereas at Canon, the aperture settings were on the back of the camera, namely in the back wheel on the camera. In Sony, if I remember correctly, the camera is set where the front is the aperture setting and the shutter setting is on the back. And I like to have it reversed. I would like to have it the way I used to have it with Canon, just because that's the way it's ingrained in my head. Use my index finger for shutter and my thumb for aperture. So that's why I have set this to the top setting like this. The AV or TV rotate is when you turn the dials or the wheels for aperture values or shutter values, which way do they rotate? And for example, Nikon and Canon have those set in reverse. The normal way is the way us Canon shooters are accustomed to using them. Whereas, to add, you go to the right, to minus, you move to the left. And that's what normal is, and that is the default. But if you're accustomed to something else, you can change that to reverse. The dial exposure compensation is set to off. You got a couple of different ones. You could set that to be one of the two wheels that are at the top of the camera, the front one in your index or the one in the thumb. But this is, redundant, because the A7R4 has a dedicated, just like this A7R3 has a dedicated exposure compensation dial. So, you could add it in here if you wanted to, but I leave that to off. Another setting that I find super important is the movie button. I believe this is always set, or the default is for this to be set to always. I like mine to be movie mode only. And what that does is, if you've ever run into this, and this was really an issue with older cameras because the movie button was prominent on the back and it was easy to hit that button accidentally. And then all of a sudden you're walking around and your camera's filming the ground as you're walking, and it would fill up your card. And when you went to take a picture, your card was full and you didn't know why. And that was why, because that button, the movie button, was depressed by accident and the camera started filming a movie. Now the buttons on the A7R4 are harder to press by accident, but it can still happen. So that's why I changed this mode from always to movie mode only. What this means is that the movie record button on the back of the camera only works when the camera is in movie mode. Okay, let's keep going here. Audio signals are set to on, and this is the last page of Camera 2 menu. Let's take a quick look at the 3 pages here on the network menu. Send to smartphone function. This allows you to send images to your smartphone really quickly, or send to your computers really quickly. We're not going to get really into those. I like to set my camera with the location info link set, and that's something I can do another video on if you guys are interested in. This allows you to link your camera to your mobile phone so that it can actually record GPS information for you. And save that information onto the images that you're taking. It's kind of clunky and it works most of the time, but it's actually really useful information to have your GPS coordinates saved onto the images. This camera does not have a built-in GPS, and to be perfectly honest, I'm okay with that, because the built-in GPSs consume quite a bit of power, quite a bit of camera power. So I prefer for it not to have a built-in GPS. But still, this is kind of an easy way for you to record GPS information with your camera. Bluetooth remote control. I have a Sony Bluetooth remote control. This one right here is actually a great little remote control that I like quite a bit. It connects your camera via Bluetooth, and that's what this is, so you can turn it on or off. You still have to pair it using the Bluetooth settings. But again, that's something that I can do another video on if you guys are interested on going and using that remote and going through the process of setting it up. Network 3, not something that we really need to be concerned about. Playback, this allows you to do all sorts of things to an image. You'll protect it so that it doesn't get erased. Rotate an image in the camera if you wanted to. Rate the image. Send the camera for printing. I don't know who does that from a camera, but it's there. Allows you to copy images from one card to the other if you needed to. Allows you to enlarge images, which you can control on the back of the camera as well, but there's all sorts of settings here. That's something really that I work with very much. Looking here, this allows you here, this is really important, select playback media. If you're using both memory slots in your camera, this allows you to choose which memory slot the camera is going to show when you press the playback button on the back of the camera. This is important. The display rotation, I set that to off. So I don't know if you notice, well, when you're taking with your camera, if you're shooting a vertical shot, right? And then you look at it on the back of your camera in a horizontal way, the image is shown kind of skinny on the back of the camera with black bars on both sides of the screen. Really showing you the image much smaller. So the display rotation, by turning that to off, what it'll do is it'll always show you the picture full frame on the back of the camera, so you can actually get a much better view of the image, whether you shot it vertical or horizontal. The information about whether you shot the image horizontal or vertical is still embedded in the raw file, so when you bring that into Lightroom or whatever else program you use, the Lightroom already knows how to turn it. So it's not like you have to manually change it afterwards, but it really only applies to the back of the camera. So again, I love to have that turned off so that my images always show, taking up the entire frame on the back of the camera. Okay, we have 7 more pages to go. This is the setup system. This is interesting, and I can't go in these right now because of the way that I'm recording, but the monitor brightness and the viewfinder brightness on the camera. I'd like to have my monitor brightness set manual, not automatic. And there's a very good reason for this, is that if you set it to automatic, when you are in a bright setting outside, when there's full sun, for example, the brightness on the back of the camera is going to be set to the maximum. And that may lead you to a false sense of confidence on how well exposed your image is. We should never evaluate exposure based on the image on the back of your camera. We need to evaluate exposure based on the histogram. But we're human and we look at the back and we see the exposure. We oftentimes judge the exposure by looking at the back of the camera. And guess what? If the brightness is varying by the camera is varying the brightness of the screen automatically, you're going to have problems in achieving consistent exposure. So that's why I like to set my brightness to a fixed setting so it doesn't change, both for the monitor, the monitor on the back of the camera, as well as the viewfinder. I like to set that manually. And I set that usually 1 click north of center. So 1 click plus from center as far as brightness is concerned, but up to you. It's really personal preference. But I would encourage you to set it manually as opposed to automatic. Get it off automatic, because that may influence your exposure. All the other settings here are default. Display quality here, I'm going to do high as well. I believe that is the default nowadays. It not used to be with the A7R III, but I believe with the A7R IV it is high. I can't remember for sure. Power save start time, I set mine to 5 minutes, which this means if I left the camera on and I'm walking around with the camera on, I wanted to power off after 5 minutes of inactivity. And the reason I do that is to save battery. I don't like to have it set to 30 seconds, which I believe is the default. To me, that's too short. 5 minutes is about right. Sorry, did I do? Yeah, 30 minutes, sorry. So the settings are 10 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, or 30 minutes. 30 minutes is too long for me. I believe the default is 1 minute. 5 minutes is what I prefer, but it's really up to you. Another thing here is touch operation. I like to turn touch operation off. I feel that the touch screen on the back of the camera, which you can use to set your focus point, it doesn't work all that well. Meaning it actually works if you're using the camera, looking at the back of the camera and you touch it, that works really well. The camera is supposed to turn off the touch operation when you have your face up to the viewfinder. I'm left eye dominant, so when I put the camera up to my eye, my nose is touching that viewfinder in the back of the screen. It's touching the screen on the back of the camera. And guess what? My nose may actually activate and change my focus point without me knowing. That happened to me when I first switched to Sony, and it drove me nuts. It took me a while to realize that's what was going on, that my nose was changing my focus point. So I like to turn the touch operation off. If you love touch operation, that's great. This is, again, these are my settings, my go-to settings. So these are all kind of default settings, so not much to look at. Okay, let's go to page 4 here of the setup 4. And not much here to change really, except to make sure that you have USB power supply on. If you want to power your camera via a USB cable, yes, you can actually power the camera by connecting a USB. This is really good if you're looking to do long time-lapse images and the internal battery is not going to last you long enough. You can use an external big battery pack and connect it to the camera and allow the camera to shoot for hours and hours and hours. This also allows you to charge the batteries while they're in the camera as well. With the camera off, you can plug in the camera to a USB power and it'll charge the batteries internal. Really, really useful. It saved my skin. I was once on a 2-week trip and my charger died halfway through the trip. If I wasn't able to charge my batteries using this mode, I would have been, in deep trouble because I would not have been able to charge my batteries. So this is actually a really life-saving feature, so one that I encourage you to turn on. Looking here at any of the other information, yep, on the copyright info, I will actually set my, my information in here. And I can set my copyright info actually to write to the camera as well, to the files as well, which I would definitely do. So you have both, you can set the photographer, and you can set your copyright. And those may be different depending on what you're shooting. For example, if you're shooting for hire, the copyright for the images may be owned by somebody else than the actual photographer. So that's why you have 2 different settings here. So I set my copyright info to on, and I set my information for both photographer and copyright. And you can actually, by clicking on display copyright info, actually see the information that's set for both photographer name and copyright holder name. I also have it write the serial number of the camera to the files, to the raw files themselves. That has saved my bacon a couple times as well, because I had a camera that was malfunctioning and there were 2 identical cameras. Couldn't really tell which camera was having the problem with, but by looking at the serial number, that really helped me out. Record media settings. Now, this is important in that you can set here where the files are going to be recorded on the 2 different slots on the camera. I have the camera prioritizing the recording media in slot 1, so it will always try to write to slot 1 first. And then you have a bunch of different functions in here. So prioritize record media 1, what this means is that it's going to write to the slot in media 1, in the slot 1, that's where it's going to write the files. And then I have audio, auto switch media on. What this will do is it'll record to slot 1, and if that slot gets filled, then it'll go in and switch to the second slot and start writing to the second slot. I always have 2 memory cards on my camera, and I don't have them writing, to both cards at the same time. I have them in relay mode, where there's fill the first one and then goes to the second one. And in this section here, recording mode is actually where you can choose, how those 2 slots are treated. You can, for example, here simultaneous with a picture in the brackets. What this means is it's going to write the images to both cards at the same time. So primary and then a backup, if you will. Same thing for video. or will only do it for videos. In this mode here, it will record simultaneously the video to both cards, but not the still images. This one simultaneously will do both the video to the stills to one card and the videos to another card. It will sort them. Same thing here. It will sort. Sorry, let me restate that. I said that wrong. Simultaneously, in this way, it will actually save both stills and videos in both cards simultaneously. It's like a backup, if you will, between the two. This will sort. We'll put the raw files. If you're shooting RAW plus JPEG, it'll sort the files where it'll put the RAWs in one in the top, and then the JPEGs in the bottom, slot 2. And this one does the reverse. It'll put the JPEG files on the slot 1 and then put the raw files in slot 2. And then this one will actually sort the files by type. So the pictures or the stills will go on slot 1 and the movies will go on slot 2. But I have it on standard, so it only records the pictures, records everything onto my prioritized recording media. So it'll always write to slot 1, and then because I have the auto switch media on, it'll then switch over to slot 2 if slot 1 fills up. Okay, let's move on to page 6. We're almost done here. There are a number of settings here, file and folder settings. What I'd like to have, there's a couple of settings here that I'd like to set on my camera. And is the file number. I want it to be in the series, meaning that from the first picture that I take onto the last picture that I take on the camera ever, it's going to serially put numbers to that camera. So the very first shot that I take is going to be number 1, and then it's going to add over the life of the camera. Reset, what that will do is that every time you put a new card in, you format a card or put a blank card in, it's going to start from serial number 1. So it's going to reset the image counter for every time, every new card that you put in. So I like to have it in series, so it's always the perpetually the number of shots that I've taken. This is an easy way also to find out how many actuations you've had on your camera, because you just look at the serial number and it'll tell you. Set file name, and this is a prefix that you can add to your images. And what I like to do is, because this is a 7R Mark IV, I like to set this to 7R4 as opposed to the default that it comes with. And that way I know when I'm downloading images and I maybe intermix them with my images from my A9, I know which cameras are from the A9 and which ones are from the 7R4. Coincidentally, my A9 here, it would say A9. And you can see down here what the example would be. Because I'm shooting Adobe RGB, it'll do _7R4 and do 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's the serial number that it would add to the files as they're shot. Then you can also here create a new folder, which I'm not going to do. But the folder name, you have two options here. It's a standard form or date form. And what the date form is that it creates a folder for each day, having the date as part of the folder name. So each day will create a new folder, and it will put the images of that day into that specific folder. And that's great, so that if you're doing, for example, bunch of images on day 1 and then a bunch of images on day 2, but you didn't download them, that night, it will actually put the images from day 1 in one folder and the images on day 2 on another folder. Okay, and this is again the similar as it is for stills. This is for video as well. And I do also set, for example, the file format name to have the year, the date in the front, and then my prefix, and then the serial number of the files as well. Again, in perpetuity for the camera, because my file number up here is set to series. Just like we did for the stills, we have similar settings for file settings. Okay, there's not much else there for us to look at. So on setup 7, the last page, we have a way to save and the settings and save them and load them back up if needed onto another camera or to the same camera. And that's it. I'm not going to go into my menu settings, and that will do as a separate video because that could take a while. This video is already over an hour long. I don't want to add to it. I'm going to break this up into different sections. I will do another video for my menu and for my custom buttons and my custom function. So look for those in the very near future, as I'll have those as complete separate videos, just to keep this video from turning into a 2-hour long video. Well, folks, thank you again for joining me. I hope you found this information useful. And if you did, share it with your friends. And if you haven't done so, please subscribe to my channel. Hit that little bell so you get notified when I post new videos. Thanks again, and until next time, take care.